When you are categorizing people by age, you're not able to fully leverage all the talent that you have around you. You have minimized the power and the strength of what's accessible to you as a leader. You've decided the older person on your team won't change, and so you stop offering them interesting work, and they feel the door close, and then they pull back. And now they actually are the disengaged veteran you assumed they were or were afraid they were, except that you actually contributed to building that. I've watched it with, let's say an engineer who's been around for 25 years at a company that everybody roots around because they've decided that he's too set in his ways. Also seen it with, let's say, an operations manager who's run the same function for a decade and gets talked past every time there's a new initiative. The assumption changes how you treat a person, and then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy and become true.
Welcome to You Might Try This, a podcast about learning how to lead without losing yourself along the way. Hosted by executive coaches Stacey and Cade. This show draws on 25 years of experience working with high-level leaders and brings those lessons down to earth. If you're navigating leadership for the first time, managing people, questioning old rules, and trying to build a career that actually feels good, you're in the right place. This is You Might Try This, honest leadership advice for ambitious people who still want to sleep at night.
Hey, everybody.
Welcome back. That was a quick one, Stacey.
Hey, everybody.
Welcome back to You Might Try This. Is this show for people who are stepping into leadership and figuring it out in real time. So I'm Cade, and Stacey's here, of course, as always. And today we're getting into something that I think runs underneath a lot of the work of leaders. And we're going to come at it from a direction that people usually don't.
Well, last week we talked about belonging, which is something you build on purpose as a leader in 100 small ways. And we talked about the fact that belonging often isn't stopped by some dramatic exclusion. It's really muted by the assumptions that you make about people. And one of the most central assumptions we make about people in about a half second after we meet them is how old they are. Somebody walks in, they've said maybe one word, and you've immediately sorted them. The young one who's unproven, they're going to be a lot of work. The older one who's, they've stopped changing. We all do it, and we do it pretty fast. So where I want us to spend some time today is on the small verdicts that we hand people because of the generation they were born into, and how that verdict quietly changes the way that you lead them.
Yeah, and I think, most of us we feel the receiving end. We feel being on the receiving end of that type of verdict long before we actually catch ourselves doing it. You'll notice a room sizing you up before you notice yourself doing it to somebody else.
It's true. It's true. And what's also interesting is there's a version of this that you run on yourself too. There's a moment where you think, I'm too young. People won't take me seriously. That's a tape. Or, further along, they've decided I've checked out or I can't innovate. We all get those because almost everyone who's listening right now, we've played those tapes on other people and on ourselves. The place that I see this do a lot of damage isn't the story you tell yourself. It's the story you tell about other people when maybe they're not fully accurate, because you tend to act on those stories without really noticing that you are doing it.
Yeah. And I think we've mentioned this before, and it's probably worth coming back to this fact that if you look at when people actually become managers versus when they receive any real training for it, there's quite a gap. So we know that the average person steps into their first management job somewhere around the age of 30. But the average age for the first piece of formal leadership training is around 42. So you've got this 12-year stretch where you're leading people and kind of learning just by doing, or kind of, more honestly, getting it wrong and figuring it out, adjusting. Something close to 60% of new managers say they got no real training during that stretch at all.
Isn't that crazy? 12 years is a long time
to be flying by the seat of your pants.
figuring it out. It's crazy. It's crazy. And that 12-year stretch is also when it's the window where you tend to set your habits as a leader.
Yeah.
So whatever you're leaning on or reading about people, you kind of continue to do it. And because no one's giving you feedback, you're like, well, must be working. So you just keep doing it.
So you got to think about what that means regarding how we read people. For 12 years, you're kind of making it up, running on instinct. And, the fastest instinct that any of us has for sizing someone up is often age. It's the first thing you see. And so without anybody ever teaching us to question it, we lean on it. And so we let how old someone is stand in for what they can do.
It's true. It's true. Can you say more about that, Cade? Because that's the piece that always intrigues me. It's that it's, kind of going in both directions, young and old, if you will.
Yeah. So, it's like the same person who's convinced that the room has decided that they are too young. They walk out of the meeting and they do the exact same thing to someone else. So, that's a file that they begin to keep on that 23-year-old. They've got that 23-year-old on the team and they've already decided that person needs everything spelled out. Or they've got the guy who's 58 and they've decided, I'm not going to bring him new projects. It's the same move that is, you realize, happening to you, but you're just now pointing it outward.
It's interesting. It's interesting. And what is, I think, difficult for people is that there's a cost to judging people on their age. And we assume it's kind of become, what's the word I want to think about? Accepted that we talk a lot about the difference in generations. Every time I turn around, there's an article or a reel or something about, how the difference in generations. But the research, and we'll get to this later on, is that there's actually less difference in generations than we think there are. And when we start putting people into those categories and telling stories about who people are based on their age, it tends to influence how we start relating. You stop watching the actual person and you manage who you think they are or the character you've cast them as. And that tends to show up not in a dramatic bias. It's just who you quietly, how you quietly stop maybe bringing them projects or taking to meetings or how you delegate to them. It just begins to show up very quietly.
Yes. And we often talk about power dynamics and power in the room. And I think that the research that we have to share this week relates to that. And it becomes really important to recognize your power as the manager here. So in 1995, there were two social psychologists at Stanford, Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson. And they ran a set of studies that became some of the most cited work in the field. And the original version was about race. So they brought in Black students and they brought in white students. All of them were strong students at the same school. And they gave them a genuinely hard verbal test. This is the kind of questions that you'd see on the GRE. Same test for everybody. The one thing that they changed was a single sentence that they said right before people picked up their pencils. For one group, they described the test exactly what it looked like. It was a real measure of your verbal ability. Something that shows how strong you are in that domain. For the other group, they called that very same test a lab problem solving task, a puzzle. It wasn't measuring anybody's ability. So that language you'll see really matters.
That's fascinating because it was the same test, same caliber of student, and just changing one sentence about what the test was. Did it actually influence how people scored?
Yeah, it influenced it a lot. So the group that had a stereotype about their ability kind of hanging over them, they did measurably worse. But it was only in the version where the test was billed as a measure of ability. When the same test was just a puzzle, described as a puzzle, that gap mostly closed. And they went further than that. So in a later version, they stripped the setup down to almost nothing. So they didn't even really say that sentence. They didn't say on one hand, a measure of verbal ability, on the other hand, a puzzle. They stripped all that out. All they did was they had people mark their background on a little demographic form, like one box where you check your race. So no framing about ability at all, but just checking that box, just making the group membership present for a second was enough to pull the scores down. So same people, same ability, but measurably worse because the stereotype had been made present right before they sat down.
It's fascinating because they weren't insulted. Nobody told them they would fail. That's what's striking about it to me is that something so small as referencing their group membership was enough to make a difference.
Yes. And they went on to call this the stereotype threat. And the part that matters most for us is the why here. So it's not that the stereotype makes you believe you're worse. Most of the people in those studies didn't believe that at all. It's that some of your attention quietly peels off. It gets peeled off to manage it. Like part of your mind starts running this second process. Am I about to confirm this thing that people believe to be true? Am I about to confirm that thing right now? And that little second process that your brain begins to run, it eats bandwidth that the rest of your brain needs to complete the task. So you do worse. Not because the stereotype was true going in, but because performing against it used up the capacity that could have made it false. And this thing has been replicated a lot of ways since, like including more recently with age, both younger and older workers.
It's so interesting. And I think it's a really important point that they didn't buy the story about themselves of the stereotype. It's just that having to keep an eye on it was, eating up the attention that the work needed. It's like they had to run it in the background and it took energy away.
Yeah. And so, in the original studies, and this is where we'll translate it, because in the original studies, that stereotype got made present by a researcher in the lab, either by saying out loud, this is a measure of ability, or requiring them to check that little box. But out in the world that you and I are often in, and that we're discussing on this podcast, on a team, the person who makes the stereotypes present is usually the boss. You're the one who's decided that the 23-year-old needs everything spelled out. So you spell it out, you check in twice as often, and they feel that. And now part of their head is running that second process instead of doing the work. As the boss, you're the one that decides the 58-year-old won't take to this brand new system. So you're going to brief him last and kind of lightly, he catches that tone. And so now he begins to lean back. So in the lab, the threat of activating that secondary system that peels away your ability, like that was the sentence on the test. On a team, it's the temperature that you set around people, so you've got to really begin to think, what extent am I doing this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think most of us, and research bears this out too, we tend to relate to the person who's being judged and not the person who's judging us. Most of us would never picture ourselves as, putting pressure in the room or, not seeing people accurately. We tend to think of ourselves as being helpful. That's why it's so easy to miss this.
Yes. The role that you decided somebody was playing before they ever opened their mouth, like on a team, you don't just hold that script in your own head. You hand it to them and how you talk to them and what you trust with them, and how you manage them. And a lot of time they start running the lines that you wrote for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And from the coaching side, where I've seen this show up is it usually comes out in one of two ways. The first one points to the young person, and it's what we'd call like the hover. You've decided they're not ready, so you over-explain, you check in more than the work actually needs, you stay closer than you would with anyone else. And what they hear underneath all that helpfulness is that you don't really think they can do it. Right, and that's pretty difficult.
And they feel that hovering, even when every single check-in on its own may look perfectly reasonable, they've begun to get the clue.
Exactly. And the second one points sort of in the opposite direction. It's the person who's been around a while, the veteran. And that's where you sort of fade out. You've quietly decided that the other person is, set in their ways and they're not going to change. So you stop handing them stretch assignments or new work or projects. You stop asking them, what they think about a new thing. And you route them to more predictable work. You focus on their past experience versus new opportunities. And nobody announces either of these, that sort of hover or the fading out. They live in just, who you CC, who you include in meetings, who gets messy, interesting problems, whose ideas you build in the meeting. It's very subtle.
Yeah. It is subtle. You would swear that it was never a conscious decision. It just feels like how you happen to treat different people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I was thinking about a leader that I worked with a while back who had someone on their team in their late 50s. And that leader had more or less, filed the person off as coasting to retirement. And they weren't bringing them anything new. They weren't unkind about it. They weren't obvious about it. They just stopped giving them certain projects and assumed that they didn't want anything new. And when we actually looked at it, it turned out that that person had been teaching himself the company's new forecasting platform on his own time because nobody had thought to ask him about it or teach it to him. And the leader had written a whole story about where that person was, and he was standing somewhere completely differently. So we didn't need to change him or fix him or get him to do anything different, even though she was frustrated with him because there was nothing to fix. We just got her to change her script around how she was thinking about that person and start giving him some different experiences. And then a lot of what she was referring to as his disengagement suddenly turned out to disappear because it was really more hers than his.
Wow. Fascinating, Stacey.
I think, I want to get back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, which is the myth of generational differences at work. People love to talk about this. It's so fun, right?
It is fun, actually.
It's fun. It's like, well, they're not like kids these days, right? I had to walk to school uphill both ways.
Remember, I used to say, we called them Jen, why do I have to work? Did you ever hear that one?
No. And that's a good end. And, let's be honest, many consultants make a lot of money trying to identify and explain differences. There's sort of a whole thing around it. But what if those differences weren't as big as we think they are? There are two researchers, I think David Costanza and Liesl Finkelstein, who reviewed the actual research studies on generational differences at work. And they pulled them together and they looked at what the data really showed about whether boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, did they genuinely want different things from a job? Did they behave differently at work? Were they committed differently? And what they found, more or less, is that the differences are small. They're inconsistent from study to study, and a lot of what does show up is better explained by how old someone is at the moment or by what's going on in the economy than by which generation they belong to. So it's more about life stage than cohort or the context of the moment in the economy. Right.
Yeah. So like once you actually stack up all the studies next to each other, the big generational story kind of washes out, right?
It does. It does. The basic conclusion, and I'm softening their language a little bit, was that the generation somebody comes from is a much weaker predictor of how they actually are at work than all of us treat it as being.
Yeah, which is kind of a strange thing to hear because most of us are pretty invested in the idea that the gap is real.
We are, because it gives us a sense of identity. We can we can make jokes, but I find it kind of freeing, honestly, because it means this thing that you've been bracing against, this idea that there's some real deep gap between the generation over here and the generation over here. And how are you going to manage it is a bit of a story that we've all agreed to tell. The gap you're managing in your head is bigger than the gap that's actually in the room. People are more different than their generations. So most of what looks like a generational difference is just a person at a particular stage of life in an organization wanting roughly the same things people have always wanted out of work. And there's a lot of variety within that generation. And it's important that we remember that.
You can see that that's beginning to give us something that we can start to work with. I think what's really useful about that, in addition, is that it kind of cuts in both directions. So, we've spent quite a few episodes talking about the script that you run on yourself, like what's the identity that you hold and how is your identity changing now that you've begun to lead others. And now we're actually turning it more inward. I think the same research that says the gap is mostly a story also says the gap that you see in other people is a story. So most of us are running it outward all day without clocking it. There's the new hire who's 23 and you've quietly filed them under their generation. So with that, we're saying entitled, needs constant feedback's not going to stick around. But that's before they've really done much of anything to prove that true.
Yeah, and you'd never say those words out loud. It just shows up in how much rope you give them or what kinds of projects you provide them, what opportunities you provide them. That's how it shows up.
Yeah. And we've also said the same about like the 58-year-old, how may be afraid of change, blah, blah, blah. So we've been using this case of the 23-year-old, the 58-year-old. But in both of those cases, like you're doing to them more or less exactly what you were afraid the room was doing to you when we talked about, you emerging as a leader and your identity and how do you speak to power, blah, blah, blah.
It's true. And the cost of that is pretty significant because when you are categorizing people by age, you're not able to fully leverage all the talent that you have around you. You have minimized the power and the strength of what's accessible to you as a leader. You've decided the older person on your team won't change. And so you stop offering them interesting work and they feel the door close and then they pull back. And now they actually are the disengaged veteran you assumed they were afraid they were, except that you actually contributed to building that. I've watched it with, let's say an engineer who's been around for 25 years at a company that everybody roots around because they've decided that he's too set in his ways. I've also seen it with, let's say, an operations manager who's run the same function for a decade and gets talked past every time there's a new initiative. The assumption changes how you treat a person, and then it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy and become true.
Yeah. And I think what's happening in both the case of the 23-year-old and the 58-year-old is that you're letting the age thing be like, it should be the least interesting fact about them, So the 23-year-old you've got to stop thinking about the 23-year-old in the context of their generation, but begin thinking about this person as a specific human being with specific strengths that you haven't mapped yet. And oh, by the way, they might be pretty good with Claude and ChatGPT. They could teach you a thing or two. The 58-year-old is also this specific human being who, might be bored or could be the most willing learner on the team. And you're not going to know which until you bring them something real and then see what they do with it. And you at, I don't know, let's say 31, 32, like you're a specific person with a specific set of things that you're already good at and a specific set of things that you genuinely haven't learned yet, and the not yet learned part isn't about your age. It's just the part you've not yet gotten to.
Yeah. And I think many times dropping the script, if you will, ends up being quite a relief because running a script is exhausting. From the research you cited earlier, running a process in the background all day about what age means in the room, whether it's your age and how you think people are going to perceive you or carrying around a whole set of verdicts about everybody else's age. That's work. And it's work that isn't getting you anything. It's not valuable work. Getting genuinely curious about people turns out to leave a lot more room to work with them in new ways than just using the shorthand of categorizing them into groups based on their identity.
Yeah. All right, Stacey, 3 experiments like always, and like always, pick one. Don't try to run all 3 this week.
And I'd like to say gently that please notice which one you don't want to do, because that's usually the one with your name on it, and you might consider doing that one.
Perfect. So the first one that I'll give you is what I'd call the counter read. So, the next time you catch yourself in that feeling, they're not taking me seriously because I'm the youngest one here. Stop and actually write that assumption down, like the literal sentence. They think I'm too junior to run this. And then underneath it, write down the actual evidence, not how it feels, but the evidence, who said it, what they did that shows it. And what I think you'll find almost every time is that the evidence column comes out basically empty. There's a pause somebody took that you filled in with a meaning. It's back to the whole work that we discussed a couple of episodes ago with Chris Argis and the ladder of inference. You've taken a specific occurrence and you filled it in with meaning through your filters and your insecurities, and you've decided this person has decided you are too young. But if you just go back to like what the person actually did, again, oftentimes it's going to come up empty. So
I really love that because putting it on paper is so important. I know that when I was younger, as a woman, I often tried to explain to people as sometimes your identity can make you paranoid. Right? I would not know in a room, well, is it because I'm young? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because of whatever? And writing it down on paper helps you see things that, is there evidence or not? Because sometimes there is, right? We all get judged, as we've just talked about. We judge other people on who they are. But sometimes it is what we carry in our head. And so feeling swears it's the truth right up until you ask it for a specific fact. So writing it on paper can make a big difference.
Yeah. And now and then, perhaps the evidence column isn't going to be empty. Like somebody genuinely did treat you as, a novice. But now you've got something you can actually work with because it's specific. Like it's a conversation that you might need to have with one person. It's not this fog that comes into every room with you. It's a specific thing with one person, and that's something that you can do about in a way that just that fog, if you will, can help you.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to go with one, and I'm going to call it the straight ask. This is when you're managing someone who genuinely has more years of experience than you do. And you can feel yourself sliding into one of two moves. You're either overasserting yourself or you're shrinking. And instead of either, the move here is to name it once plainly and then ask for what you need. So what that might sound like is, hey, let's say, Cade, you're older than me, because you are, right?
No, you.
Damn it.
Friend. Isn't it
it's
like
only
10,
it's 10 days. 10 days. Yeah. It's 10 days. Okay, fine. Okay.
Not that it matters, Stacey. We've just spent a whole episode talking about how it doesn't matter.
10 days matter. Okay, so I'm going to pretend that you're older than me. And if you were, I might say something like, hey, Cade, since you've been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I'd be foolish not to use that experience, I'm going to lean on you for the history here. And I'm going to lean on you for X, Y, and Z of your experience and expertise. I also want to say there are going to be some calls I make that you might make differently, and I will own those. That's the whole thing, is you're saying it's a balance, right? You're saying, Cade, you've got this experience and I'm going to use that. And I want to be clear that I might do some things differently than you. And that's it. That's the whole thing. You don't overcomplicate it. You just straight up say the difference, and then you ask for what you need. So you might say, I'm going to need some history and I'm going to welcome your perspective, but I'm going to need you to understand that I might do some things differently. And that's it. And you stop performing around it and just keep kind of going on your way.
And what I really like about that is you're not giving anything away by saying that. Like the experience gap is already in the room. You're just like now naming it out loud.
Exactly. Yep. And what happens is the thing that you've it's been sitting under the table, you take it and you're putting it on top of the table. And that way it stops quietly running the dynamic, if you will. Usually the other person relaxes a little, you relax a little bit because it's in the air and you've been trying to manage it. And usually you only have to do it once, which is sort of the point of it.
I like it. And this is off the table for good. You're not quietly kind of working toward it every week. You've said it, it's done. On top of the table, as you said, move on.
Yep. And I'm going to give one more, Cade, which is what
Please.
I call the one exception. So I want you to think of one person on the team that you've most quietly filed under their generation. So the young one you've decided is flaky or inexperienced. The older one you've decided is done growing. Pick the actual person on your team. And this week, go looking for one piece of evidence that cuts against your file on them. You can think of this as what's called a counterfactual. But you're leaning into looking for the opposite of what you believe. So bring them something real, a problem, a stretch, a piece of interesting work, and watch what they actually do with it instead of what you assume they do, to see if perhaps there's more room between how you're filing them with their generation and what they can actually do. You're not trying to overturn the whole story in a week that you have about someone. You're just looking for an exception. Because in my experience, that one exception is usually enough to remind you that there's more leverage in your team. There's more capability. There's more you can lean on.
Excellent. So we've got the counter read, the straight ask, and the one exception, right? You might try this. You might try one of these.
Perfect. And then next week, let's stay here in relationships. But I think we're going to turn the lens around a bit. Today, I know we've spent a lot of time on how we read other people, how do we categorize them by age, the verdicts that we hand them. And next time, we're going to look at it the other way, which is how do you get read? How do other people perceive you? Whether you get seen for the work you're actually doing without turning it into someone who's always performing it. And that's what we're going to talk about next week.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. I'll see you then.
All right. See you then, Cade.
Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you for listening to You Might Try This, brought to you by EDC and Edgewise Media. To learn more about the podcast, visit youmightTryThis.com. or connect with us on social media.